Welcome to another Bradbury 101. This is the story of Ray Bradbury's The Golden Apples of the Sun, his first book to make the mainstream. Bradbury's very first book, Dark Carnival, was full of fantasy and horror stories, and published by a small press in 1947. 3 years later, his first novel appeared, The Martian Chronicles, well, really a collection of science fiction shorts. This was followed in 1951 by The Illustrated Man, another collection of science fiction stories. With these early books, Bradbury was firmly established in fantasy and science fiction. But in 1953, The Golden Apples of the Sun collected some science fiction, but also Bradbury's best mainstream stories up to that point. The title of the book is from the final lines of a poem, "The silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun," by W.B. Yeats. Bradbury became aware of the poem thanks to his wife Maggie. But there's a distinct possibility that Bradbury was already familiar with the phrase golden apples, because just a few years earlier there had been a book called The Golden Apples, a collection of short stories by an author that he admired greatly, Eudora Welty. As with Bradbury's previous collections, Golden Apples of the Sun collects 20-odd shorts, and these range from some of his earliest published works through to brand new stories. I'll pick just a few, some of them because they're my favourites, and others because they're important in one way or another. So we'll take a look at The Foghorn, The Pedestrian, The Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl, I See You Never, The Big Black and White Game, A Sound of Thunder, The Great Wide World Over There, and Hail and Farewell. Before going any further, I'd like to point out that The Golden Apples of the Sun was Bradbury's first illustrated book. Every short story in the first edition was accompanied by a line drawing by the artist Joe Munieni. He also designed the cover with its distinctive sun and moon motif. Munieni and Bradbury would work together many times over the years, and it's almost impossible to read a Bradbury story without conjuring up a Munieni image in your mind's eye. The first story in the book is The Foghorn, where an ancient creature from the deep mistakes the sound of the foghorn for one of its own kind. The story itself first appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 1951, but under a different title, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, a much more headline-grabbing name for a story, and one which was used for the film, spun off from the story. The film really had very little to do with Bradbury's story, hence the credit suggested by the sensational Saturday Evening Post story. Significantly, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms came out the same year as It Came from Outer Space, which also had a story by Bradbury. Next, The Pedestrian. This is the one about the guy who goes out walking in the city at night. What a crazy thing to do. The story is a precursor to Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451. Notice how in Munieni's images, quite often the face of the character is obscured. The Pedestrian first appeared in The Reporter in 1951, where it was also illustrated. The Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl is a classic story of developing madness, perhaps revealing the influence of Edgar Allan Poe. It's about a man who commits a murder and then becomes aware that he may have left 1 or 2 fingerprints lying about. Munieni's illustration draws on the metaphor in Bradbury's story that presents fingerprints as spiderwebs. He also sneaks in a couple of what appear to be matchbooks in the corner, one with the moon, one with the sun. And if they look familiar, it's because they're on the cover of the book. Good one, Joe. The story itself first appeared in Detective Book magazine in 1948. Bradbury's name made the cover, although the illustration on the cover is for an unrelated story. Touch and Go was its first published title, and in some ways it's a better title. Notice how the magazine illustrator has fixated on literal fingerprints. I See You Never is one of the mainstream stories in the book, and by mainstream I mean it's not science fiction, it's not fantasy, it's not horror. It's important to realise that although Bradbury was presented initially as a writer of fantasy and then as a writer of science fiction, all along he was writing in many genres, or in none. And this is one of his realist stories, although with Bradbury nothing is ever terribly real. I See You Never first appeared in The New Yorker in 1947, after being rejected 2 years earlier. Because of its appearance in this mainstream magazine, it got more attention than most of Bradbury's pulp stories. It earned him a cool $200 and was selected for Best American Short Stories in 1948. As usual for The New Yorker, Bradbury's story is buried among the advertisements. Next, The Big Black and White Game. Again, a mainstream story, not a fantasy, not a horror. It's about a small town where the white people play the black people at baseball. The message of the story is deeply anti-racist, and that's certainly the impact that it had when first published, although some of the racial language is outdated today. Again, published not in any kind of pulpy magazine, but in a serious mainstream one, The American Mercury. Because of that, it had a, shall we say, sophisticated readership, and the story was selected for Best American Short Stories 1946. It's also the oldest story in the Golden Apples of the Sun. American Mercury described the young Bradbury as currently at work on his first novel. He has been represented in anthologies of weird and unusual tales. It depends on how you classify novel, but it would be at least 5 years before Bradbury published one. Next, arguably the standout story in the Golden Apples of the Sun, A Sound of Thunder. This one is science fiction, time travel, time paradox, going back in time, hunting dinosaurs. And the Mugnani illustration is one of my all-time favourites. At the heart of the image, the dinosaur and the sun. That sweeping arc, which is the path that the time travellers must stay on, lest they change the future by mistake. But in the foreground, almost unnoticed, but once you see it dominating the image, the butterfly. Despite its science fiction nature, A Sound of Thunder placed in a slick magazine, Collier's, but the story had a magnificent colour illustration. A Sound of Thunder was also the inspiration for a film, though not a very good one.
Remember, whatever happens, do not step off of the path. We've got a major problem here!
The whole of time has been turned upside down.
What happened has to be connected to our last jump. You must have changed something.
And what did you change?
We don't know. Somebody stepped off the path.
The changes and evolution that you affected come in ripples like dropping a stone into a pond.
The 2005 movie came and went almost unnoticed, and probably did better business on DVD than it did in cinemas. Next, The Great Wide World Over There. Another non-fantasy, non-science fiction story. Another one that proved Bradbury as a mainstream writer. This concerns a woman who lives out in the sticks and can't read. It first appeared in the slick magazine Maclean's, the Canadian magazine where Bradbury appeared a number of times, and was again handsomely illustrated. Hail and Farewell. It's the story of a boy who can't grow up. Again, a magnificent Mugnani illustration of the boy arriving in the small town. Notice again the sun, or the moon, in the distance, a recurring motif throughout these illustrations. Hail and Farewell first appeared in Today, the Philadelphia Inquirer, but I've never been able to lay hands on a copy of that publication, so I can't show you its first appearance. What I can show you, though, is the preliminary artwork for Mugnani's illustration. These line drawings don't always reproduce terribly well, especially in poor quality paperback books, where the graininess of the paper sometimes interferes with the clean lines. I scanned this image directly from a 1970s paperback copy of the book. I was never quite sure what those dots in the distant sky were. But in 2014 the original sketch for this came up at auction, and this shows some remarkable detail. The dots in the sky are birds. And look at the shading on the foreground figure. Now, here's a question for you. What if you take the Golden Apples of the Sun and you add R is for Rocket, another of Bradbury's short story collections? Well, you get Bradbury Classic Stories 1 Selections from the Golden Apples of the Sun and R is for Rocket, a 1990 book from Bantam. And when the publisher decides that it wants to sell you another copy of this same hybrid, they simply retitle it as The Golden Apples of the Sun and Other Stories. And when one of those stories is turned into a film, they sell it to you again, but this time with the title A Sound of Thunder and Other Stories. Oh, and who's this? The Golden Apples of the Sun from Subterranean Press 2008? Wait a minute, you're not the Golden Apples of the Sun. You're the Golden Apples of the Sun and Other Stories, even though you don't say so. Stop trying to pass yourself off as something you are not. This is the problem with the Golden Apples of the Sun. It's almost impossible nowadays to get the original contents in the original order. All you can get is this mashup where they've crammed two books together and reshuffled. But the original Golden Apples of the Sun is the book which enabled Bradbury to be respectable, so serious critics could look at it and say, yes, he's a great writer, even if he does write the odd science fiction tale. And so it is, through this collection of stories, that Ray Bradbury made the mainstream. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.